Hello, everybody. Start coming in for here today to start our little series here on the American Revolution, since it is drawing close to the 4th of July holiday, which is next week. I wanted to go ahead and get this series going ahead and started. So this is going to be a series of roughly 4, maybe 5 videos, I think, if I'm not wrong in my calculations, how it's going to have to kind of dredge out here. So this is going to be the first. Now, to really explain the American Revolution, you have to divide it up, because if I were to do this in one humongous video, it would be a long video, and of course it's going to take a long time. That's not my thing. I want to be able to get the information to the people in bit by bit, that way they can have time to comprehend what they're hearing and what they're seeing. So, this first video today is going to be on the French and Indian War, which occurred during the 1750s and early 1760s. Now, you might ask right now, why is this war important? What does this have to do with the American Revolution? Well, it does not have to do with the American Revolution outright, because keep in mind, the American Revolution does not start until 1775. And this war ended in 1763. However, it was a colonial war in North America between the powers of France and Great Britain, and its outcome heavily influenced the American colonies on the eastern seaboard that were the 13 British colonies in two major ways. A, they had a large amount of new land that they could expand and settle in. B, the amount of money that Britain spent during this war brought about the huge increase in taxes that the British Parliament would pass and tax the American colonies with, which would cause the colonists to get very angry, start getting irate, start protesting, which eventually, down the road, leads to revolution. So although not directly, without the French and Indian War, there would be no American Revolution, because, in particular, the British Parliament would never have had any reason to pass the taxes that they passed onto the colonists because of this war, the financial burden that had taken on the nation. So in order to really understand the American Revolution, you first kind of talk about the French and Indian War as a prelude. So this video will be about the French and Indian War, and let's just go ahead and start hopping into it here. Now, the French and Indian War, as we mentioned, was mostly a colonial war. It was fought in North America between European colonial powers. Now, by the 1750s, when this war broke out, 3 major European powers have a lot of territory in North America. These powers are Spain, France, and Great Britain, also known as England, whichever one you want to call it. In this case, we're going to call it Great Britain. Now, Britain and France were particularly in conflict. All 3 were commonly in conflict with each other, but Britain and France in particular had a very stiff rivalry between the two. Now, Britain's exploration had begun in North America back during the late 15th century, shortly after Christopher Columbus had discovered quotations around the discovered in 1492, and the English, or British, first came over here and started exploring the New World, as it was called, in about 1497, I believe, when they sent the explorer John Cabot, I don't know how they say his name, to explore the coast of North America, near Newfoundland and New England. So this was Britain's first really big exploration of North America. British colonies were soon followed and established in North America. In 1587, you had Roanoke, that lost a little colony that no one knows what happened to the people that settled it. 1607, you had the settlement of Jamestown in Virginia, which was the first permanent settlement. 1620, I believe, you had the Pilgrims arrive in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And then as the years go on, multiple new colonies begin to be organized, such as Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. All of these states, future states, colonies become formed out of the British possessions on the eastern seaboard, which is mostly where the British tend to set up their colonies, as on the eastern seacoast of North America. The French began exploring in the 17th century, during the 1600s, when their main explorer was by a guy by the name of Robert Cavelier de La Salle. Yes, I love the French for their long names. Now, La Salle had kind of sailed up the St. Lawrence River. He'd gone through the Great Lakes region, and then he continued on, and he actually sailed down the Mississippi. And along the way, La Salle claimed all lands for France that the Mississippi touched, that it drained, that it connected. All of it he claimed for France, in what became known as the major, big, gigantic French colony of New France, which, I think you had New France mostly in the north, and then in the south, you actually had the lower portion of it was typically what we called Louisiana, and the northern part of New France was Canada, basically. Keep in mind, this is why Quebec has a large French-speaking population in Canada, is because it was not originally a British colony, it was originally actually a French colony. In fact, where I live here in Ohio, the part I live in, was actually part of New France at the time. If you follow the lines, the section of Ohio that I live in actually would have fallen within the lines of New France. So this originally, where I'm standing, would have been French territory. By the 18th century, which gets us to the 1700s, the claims of Britain and its 13 colonies, basically, they wrap around the seacoast, and then you got France, who's got Canada, basically. Canada's their big possession, but they have Louisiana territory down over here. Now, it isn't until the 18th century that conflict really starts to heavily loom between the two colonial powers over their colonies in North America. And this comes about for one particular reason. The British settlers in the 13 British colonies on the seacoast wanted to expand westward. They wanted to expand their territory and settle new lands in order to expand their living space. Well, unfortunately, this comes into conflict with the French. The British want to go west. Well, that heads right to the Mississippi. Well, France lays claim to the Mississippi. And France, its colonists, are wanting to head south, from Canada down. Well, that comes in conflict with the British. But the French, here's the odd thing, the British wanted to expand because they wanted new land for settlers, for settlement. The French were more wanting to expand, not exactly for settlement, but for new trade routes with native tribes, Native Americans, of course, because both sides had a very good trading relations with the Indians. Both of them traded with the Indians Native Americans they would trade horses, they would trade guns, they would trade European goods for the most common commodity that they would trade with the Native Americans was fur pelts, which was very, very much prized in England and France and all that to be having by the rich people. So, of course, they would trade the Native Americans that in exchange for these pelts will give you these guns and horses and stuff like that. Well, the French by far had the best relations with the Native Americans. They were very friendly to them. They hardly ever got into conflict with them, and they openly tried to encourage trade with the Native Americans. So, in the long term, France's goal is not exactly to settle new lands, but simply to expand and establish new trade routes of which it can trade more efficiently with the native tribes. Now, the main area of contention where the two sides are meeting, remember, France wants to come down south, Britain wanting to go west. Eventually, they're going to intersect, and that area is what we call the Ohio country, around the Ohio River Valley, which includes most of the area of my home state of Ohio. This, where I'm living, was the prize. This is where the spark begins. This is where stuff is going to start going wrong. And just so you got a map here, I'm going to show you here in a second. Both sides lay claim to the Ohio River Valley. They both want it, and there's a profitable fur trade in this area at that time. And there's proper, ripe land for settlement as well, and it's really prized by both sides to be able to get it. By the 1750s, the Ohio River Valley has now become the main contentious area between France and Britain and their colonies in North America. And both sides, as we mentioned, they start laying claim to the area. Both of them claim that one claims that France owns it, the other claims that Britain owns it. Beginning in the 1740s, France began to establish forts and other fortifications in the Ohio River Valley in an attempt to try to assert its control and sovereignty over the area, to try to say, yeah, we're in charge, get out, Britain, get out, now. Well, this causes fears to the British and the colonists in North America as they start believing that the French are encroaching on the 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard. And that is what's going to start setting things off here. Now, before we go any further, I want to show this photo. This is a photo here, well, not a photo, but a map of the different territories in North America of the French, British, and Spanish colonies in North America at that time, during the prior to the French and Indian War. Keep in mind, this is I think you can kind of guess where the name of French and Indian War comes from. If not, you're going to get it here in a second. We already know that France is a big one in this, and the Native Americans kind of were too. This is the map. The yellow territories are what was claimed by Spain. And of course, we can see the outline of the modern United States and Canada on it. So Spain had Mexico, Texas, all this over here, and then they have Florida. The British have this, right here's the big 13 colonies that are going to become the United States on the eastern seaboard, and also these purple areas. These were ceded to them in an earlier war, so these are actually British too. These purple and orangish areas are all British, and then the big blue is what the French claimed. Big blue is what the French claim. Right here is the Ohio country, right where Ohio is. This is the contentious area. Remember, the British want to go this way, the French want to come this way. You're going to get conflict. So what really starts this happens in the year 1753. And in that year, in 1753, the governor of the British colony of Virginia sends a young 21-year-old lieutenant colonel of the Virginia militia. And this young colonel, this young lieutenant colonel, is a man that we all know. And he comes later in life, he ends up being a very big founding father. And he's known as the father of his country, basically. And I'm pretty sure you might all know who this man is, but in case you don't, I got a painting here of him as a young man. It is none other than future President of the United States and Commander of the Continental Army, George Washington. This was him at age 21 during the French and Indian War. He was sent by the governor of Virginia, as at the time Washington was a young lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia. This is before he really had any military experience. And he's very young at this time. Washington is sent by the governor of Virginia to kind of to go to the French fort of Fort Leboeuf. And what is now Fort Leboeuf was a French fort that was located approximately where the town of Waterford, Pennsylvania is now. And he is sent there. Washington is instructed that when he goes to this fort, he is to instruct the French that they are trespassing on Virginian territory, as Virginia claimed a portion of the Ohio country for itself, and that they are to evacuate and withdraw immediately. Well, of course, Washington goes, he tells the French this, and the French are like, nah, guess what? We don't care, so no, we're not moving. This is our land, this ain't your land, so bye-bye. So the French refused to leave. And because of this, instead of retreating, they actually build a new larger fort that is located near the junction of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, which they build and name Fort Duquesne. And this is done during the winter of 1753 to 1754. Keep in mind, if you want to know where Fort Duquesne was located at, this little fork it's located at, Fort Duquesne is located on the site of what is now the present-day city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Yes, where Pittsburgh is where Fort Duquesne was. And it's actually somewhat preserved there. There's a park that they got the outline of the old fort kind of labeled at. You can go see for yourself. So, in May of the following year, 1754, George Washington is sent back by the governor of Virginia. He's sent with a detachment of militia under his command. And this is Washington's first time he's actually leading troops in his life, and this is his first big military experience he gets. Washington didn't play a pivotal part in the war. I will add this. He didn't play exactly a pivotal part, but for him, the war was pivotal because it really gave him his first taste of military command. It gave him his first taste of warfare, and thus it somewhat prepared him for the skills he was going to need to have when he would later command the Continental Army during the American Revolution. So this is where Washington kind of starts getting his rise to fame, and it's also where he starts kind of getting that military experience that's going to serve him so well in the future, and the United States in general. So anyway, he's sent with this detachment of militia back to Pennsylvania, back near Fort Duquesne, and he sets up and builds a new fortification of his own that he names Fort Necessity, which he locates roughly 40 miles from Fort Duquesne. Well, on May 28th, Washington's militia encounter a small French scouting party, and a battle ensues between the two. Now, out of the scouting party of the French ends up being the loser. The scout commander, whose name was Colonel de Jumonville, was killed, along with 9 others, and 20 of the scouts were taken prisoner. Of course, the French find out about this really quick, and they do not like hearing that just 40 miles away, the British have not only erected a new fort, but they have also attacked a scouting party of theirs. And this ticks them off, and the French march off from Fort Duquesne, and they march to Fort Necessity, and start besieging it as retaliation. They want to destroy this fort. So they start besieging the fort on July 3rd. Keep in mind, they're marching. Despite Washington having recently received reinforcements, he had recently received reinforcements, I think, from the colony of North Carolina. He was still vastly outnumbered by the French forces that had come from Fort Duquesne, and during the night, Washington decided that he would surrender the fort to the French. So Fort Necessity was then surrendered, and basically, let me look here. Yeah, it was surrendered, and the Washington's militia were allowed to return to Virginia. They were allowed to go back, but as after they had left and gone back, the French then proceeded to burn Fort Necessity and destroy it. So this expedition to try to force the French out failed, and it was the spark to the gunpowder keg. It started the war. Following this failed little expedition, the governor of the colony of Virginia as a whole requests additional assistance from London, from Britain. Now, initially, King George II of England, who really has the power to give them this assistance, he's very hesitant at first to even do so, because Britain has only been at peace with France for 6 years. We just had a war 6 years ago. Do we really want to go back into another? Well, yeah, they end up saying, "Oh yeah, we do." So, regardless of the hesitancy, George II eventually concedes, and he sends General Edward Braddock to go from Britain. He was to go with a detachment of British regulars, redcoats, regular British soldiers, and they are to head out to Virginia and push the French out of Fort Duquesne. And then, at the same time, a British naval fleet is then sent to basically block the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada that will prevent the French from getting any reinforcements to send from Canada. In case you don't know where the Gulf of St. Lawrence is, I will show you here. This is the Gulf of St. Lawrence, this little area right here. And this river, the St. Lawrence River, goes down through here. And that's how the French were getting supplies, they were getting reinforcements and everything. Well, if you cut off the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they can't get in the river. New troops can't arrive from France to reinforce those in Canada and New France. Now, as the war kind of goes on, at first, the French end up kicking the British butt. I mean, they really do. At first, the French have the upper hand. They are beating the British almost every single day. And I'm not kidding you. Braddock's little expedition finally begins in July of 1755, and he takes his regulars, and he even takes George Washington with him, only because Washington had been to the area. He kind of mapped it out. He knew the area, so he brought Washington along to try to advise him based on his previous expeditions of what they should do. But he would only take the advisement. Regardless, this expedition failed, like, spectacularly. Because as Braddock is marching to Fort Duquesne, him and his troops are going around. They're traveling on a cleared road in the woods that has been cleared for them in the wilderness that has been gone there. Because at the time, this is frontier. Well, as they're marching, as we all have seen in those big old movies, the British regulars commonly would march in those big old lines of troops, just head on, straight line, up, down, up, down, up, down. They'd march in a straight line, lines up in columns, and they're all wearing bright red jackets. Normally, that's not a problem, because back then, the big thing is open warfare on the open battlefield. Just simply line up, aim your gun, and just volley each other until the other one bleeds out to death that they can't lose anymore. It's about the stupid thing of warfare. Well, the French were kind of different in this situation. The French had a lot of Native American allies already at this point, and Native Americans were siding with the French. And as Braddock's men were traveling to Fort Duquesne on this road, they had no idea that in the woods, along the road, in the trees and bushes, that French soldiers and Native American warriors had kind of staked out and were waiting in an ambush to attack these soldiers in guerrilla warfare. Basically, shoot them from the bushes, shoot them from the trees before they can really figure out what's going on and then disappear. And they spring the trap, and this works expressingly well because of one. Not only are they marching in a big line, and it's kind of hard not to miss one. It's not that hard to hit one, but on top of that, they're wearing bright red jackets that kind of stand out in the middle of the woods. You can see where they are. And the French and Indians, well, Native Americans, especially Native Americans, they're wearing clothing that is more kind of blending in with the forest colors. And this crushes Braddock's expedition, and in fact, Braddock himself is actually killed during this engagement, and George Washington actually takes command after he's killed and orders the retreat to go back to Virginia. So this fails spectacularly for the British. And it doesn't get much better, because shortly after this, the French start invading basically the territories along the eastern seaboard. In Lake Ontario, they start attacking the forts in New York, around Lake Ontario and Lake Champlain. And they take Fort Oswego in 1756 and Fort William Henry in 1757. And also in 1757, the British do try an invasion of the French port city of Louisbourg, up near what is now Halifax. Not near Halifax. Well, I think it is, kinda. But Louisbourg was located in Nova Scotia, if you know where that is in Canada. If not, we'll try to show you in a second. Unfortunately, this amphibious invasion doesn't go out real well, and the British failed to capture the city. / port. In July of 1758, a British expedition is launched from New York City under the command of General James Abercrombie, and they tried to capture Fort Colonial, which is located on Lake George in New York, and despite them outnumbering the French forces, they are outright beaten by the French, who are led by the new big commander of the French armies in North America, a man by the name of Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. And he was like an expert commander. He was the main French commander in North America at this time. And in response to the outbreak fighting that's happening, and the French are just kicking the British's butt, and then when the opportunities come that the British are launching their own attacks, they're failing when they do so. A lot of the frontier settlers start moving and fleeing east, fearing that the French are going to overrun the colonies due to the continued losses that the British are suffering. And just to kind of show you where some of the battles are taking place here, We'll show you this photograph. Let me make sure there ain't something else I need to see. Think. Oh, yeah, there's two. Here's the first one we'll do. This is kind of just a map of the theater of the war, of what was going on. Some common battle sites, like I think we mentioned Fort Duquesne. Fort Duquesne is located right here. Fort Necessity was just south. Up here you have Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario. Fort LeBoeuf was about right here. Let me look where else. Fort Carillon on Lake Champlain, right there, and Fort William Henry. And Louisbourg, who is in Nova Scotia, is right up here. We'll go back to this photo too. The other little painting we have here is a painting of the French forces after they had captured Fort Carillon on Lake Champlain. And it kind of shows the French forces cheering in triumph. And in the center of the photo is very kind of faded here, but it is supposed to be the French commander uh, Louis Joseph de Montcalm. Right here, this guy holding his hat, I think, is supposed to be him. But this was the French forces due to the flag, which had like the little, I forget what they say that is, a little gold symbol in the white is supposedly was the symbol of the Bourbon kings, the French monarchy. So in the beginning of the war, Britain's getting its butt handed to it. And it doesn't help to them that both sides are also getting Native American allies, and the British and the French aren't the only ones fighting each other. Even the Native Americans are fighting each other because they're persuaded to take sides. Both the British and French tried to persuade the different Native American tribes to side with them over the other, trying to encourage them to join in with them. And both sides do gain allies. The French gained the most, basically. They gained a lot because of their more friendly reputation and their better trading relations. The French gained allies in the tribes of the Potawatomi, the Winnebago, Ojibwa, Shawnee, Way, Huron, and Kickapoo, and the Ottawa, and I think the Lenape and Abenaki. And then for the British, they largely gain allies with the Iroquois Confederation, which consists of both, I think, of all three of these tribes, the Mohawk, the Seneca, and Oneida. And they also gain allies in the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Cayuga, and Tuscarora nations. But by far, the British kind of outnumber the French in terms of Native American allies. Well, no, not the British, the French do. Sorry. In fact, if you ever watched the film The Last of the Mohegans, that is actually based during the French and Indian War. And I think one of the main Native American villains in that is actually a Huron Indian that was sided with the French, if I'm not wrong. The Mohegan, I think he sides kind of more with the British a little bit. I think he's a member of the Iroquois. Now the tide starts turning here in the year 1758. The war started in 1755. 3 years in, the French have kicked the British's butt to the point of almost defeat. Now the British start turning the tide dramatically. And what happens is this is due to the election of the new British Prime Minister, William Pitt. Yes, this is actually who Pittsburgh is named after, because there was a fort that was built there after they captured Fort Duquesne later in the war. A new British fort named Fort Pitt was built there, and Pittsburgh was built on the same site, so they named it Pittsburgh. And Fort Pitt itself had been named after William Pitt. And he takes control of the war effort in Britain. William Pitt takes control. Now, what makes it different is I ought to say this too. In 1756, a wider global war had broken out between Britain, France, Prussia, and Russia, and a bunch of the other European powers over in Europe, as an extension of what was already going on in North America, and what we know as what Canadians and Europeans know as the 7 Years' War, as it lasted 7 years there. But Americans know it as the French and Indian because they consider it a separate theater. Where most of them consider it just a single theater in the war, the Americans consider it to be a separate war. Well, this kind of goes on with that, and Pitt kind of, as the war's going on, he finally starts realizing that if Britain wants to save its colonies, Britain needs to be focusing solely on the conflict in North America. And he realized that there may be conflicts rolling on in other parts of the globe, but the conflict in North America has the most stakes. We could lose all of our colonies if we do not push back at the French. And thus he started devoting his most vital and concentrated resources toward the war in North America. Pitt started to recruit new regular regiments in order to send them to North America in order to kind of patch up the broken regiments that had been located over there. And at the same time, he did convince British Parliament to start basically granting unlimited funds and borrowing money very heavily in order to try to finance and fund the war effort. At the same time of Pitt coming to power, Britain's Royal Navy has finally gotten to the point that they're really able to defeat almost anything on the ocean. They're the most powerful navy in the world. And they use this to their effect as they start blockading the flow of French reinforcements from Europe to Canada. And it ain't just in the Gulf of St. Lawrence anymore, it's everywhere. And they're effectively able to do this due to the strength of the Royal Navy. So this starts happening. Britain did also, it gained a lot more financial funds for the war due to Pitt's economic little program to try to fund it. And in response, this does do good because Britain's got a lot of funds it can use. However, France at this time is running low on cash and they're almost on the verge of national bankruptcy by the time the war is over. Food is also being supplied to the British because they have their colonies over there that are not having a blockade on them or nothing. They're able to still get their food to and from Britain, and they're able to, the colonies themselves grow the food. While the French colonies, well, they up in Canada, it's not exactly great farming land, and they can't really import food because the British Royal Navy blockade is stopping any reinforcements or supplies coming in from Europe, from France. In 1758, the British start going on the full offensive and they start turning the tide. In 1758, they managed to capture both Louisbourg finally and Fort Duquesne. And they also captured Fort Frontenac, which falls in that same year. In 1759, just a year later, the French finally get forced out of Fort Carillon on Lake Champlain, which later is renamed Fort Ticonderoga, which we will come to in the American Revolution here, and they are also forced to abandon Fort Niagara. Finally, to put it short, the final major conflict comes on September 13th of 1759 on the Plains of Abraham outside of the city of Quebec, which at the time was, of course, the big capital city, I think, of Canada, of New France. And in this battle, the British win one of the most decisive victories of the entire war that not only does it lead to the fall of Quebec, but it basically leads to the end of the war, as France is now left with its only stronghold left is the city of Montreal. And instead of fighting it out, the French governor of New France decides to surrender Montreal and all of the territory of New France to the British on September 8th of 1760. Now, also to put into it, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham at Quebec, it does have one other good thing that happens, and that's the factor where we talked about the French having their big commander in the form of General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. Montcalm is actually killed in this battle. He dies on the battlefield. And actually, very ironically, his British counterpart also dies on the battlefield. A general by the name of James Wolfe, who had masterminded the entire British invasion. It had gone well, but unfortunately, both of the commanding generals in this battle on both sides ended up getting mortally wounded, and they both ended up dying. Although for Wolfe's men, it was more happy because of the factor the British had won. And this is a famous painting that was done illustrating the death of the British commander at the Battle of Quebec, or the Plains of Abraham, James Wolfe, as he lay dying on the battlefield. And you can see his personal officers are around him, and so is a Native American warrior who had sided with them. So that means we have the Battle of Quebec now. So now they've gone in after capturing Louisbourg, and they've now headed in to the St. Lawrence River. They've attacked, taken Quebec right here, and then they take Montreal in 1760. The British have won the war pretty much in North America. It's pretty much done and over with. So by 1760, it's over. However, one more big change is to come to Britain, really, before this is over. Oh, I'm going to show this one, too. We mentioned William Pitt was the new British Prime Minister. Well, William Pitt, this is a painting of William Pitt, the British Prime Minister, who's really responsible for the turnaround of the French and Indian War in favor of Britain. He's really the one responsible for it. Now, unfortunately for the British, not before the peace treaty can ever be brought up and signed, Britain suffers a small little inconvenience in the factor it loses its monarch. King George II dies in I think October 25th of October 25th. I think definitely is the date. I know it's in October, but he dies in October of 1760, and his son had actually died before he did. So his only living presumptive heir that he can have is his grandson George III. And immediately following the death of his grandfather, he is then crowned King of England as King George III. That wonderful king that we're going to have a little bit to talk about as we go on this series. Now, in 1762, Spain joins in on the war on France's side in an attempt to try to reverse the outcome, and on top of that, they wanted to possibly gain Portugal in Europe. Unfortunately, the British kicked the Spanish's butt too, and they actually take control of the Spanish possessions of Cuba. So they actually kicked not only the French butt, but they kicked the Spanish butt. And this really doesn't change much. Right here is the painting of King George III on his coronation. He's wearing lavish, extravagant robes on his coronation day. This is the king that we will later rebel against. So talks begin starting in 1762, even though the last French big possessions had been surrendered in 1760. And on February 10th of 1763, the Treaty of Paris is signed in the city of Paris, France. Now, what does this treaty do? As we kind of wrap up the video here. In the treaty, the major thing is France is almost entirely wiped out off the North American continent, with a few exceptions for 2 small fishing islands off the coast of Newfoundland, and they still have some territories in the Caribbean, such as Haiti. Other than that, the French are basically wiped off the map of North America, and Britain becomes the sole major dominant colonial power in the New World. France is required in the Treaty of Paris. France is forced to cede almost every one of its colonies in North America, with Canada, to different nations. French Canada, and its lands that are the French lands that are east of the Mississippi River go to Britain, and Spain also cedes Florida to Britain. They cede Florida to Britain because, keep in mind, we said that during the war, Britain had managed to capture Cuba. Well, the Spanish wanted Cuba back, and the British made them a deal. They said, okay, you give us Florida, we'll give you back Cuba. So, in return for the return of Cuba, Spain handed Florida over to Britain, and France handed Canada and the territories east of the Mississippi River that were theirs. Now, since Spain had kind of tried to help France, Spain felt pity for them. And not Spain, but France felt pity for the Spanish. And as a goodwill compensation, they gave their lands of Louisiana that had lied west of the Mississippi, those were given to Spain. So that kind of shows what went on there. And before we really end the video, I'll show the map of what now North America looks like after this war is kind of finished. Here is after the war. France has been entirely eliminated, basically, from the North American continent with its colonial possessions. Let me see if I can pull up the other one here. Here was North America prior. Here is it now. Yeah, big difference in one war. The red were British areas to begin with, prior to the war, such as our big 13 colonies over here. Orange is what Spain had prior to the war. France has given up all the stuff in yellow and pink. And Florida, of course, was Spanish. So all this, Britain gets. Anything east of the Mississippi, Britain has gotten. So they get basically most of the eastern United States. They get Canada. And Spain gets over here. They get most of the Great Plains. So that is kind of the end of the French and Indian War. I don't want to go much further than that because that's where we're going to start mixing to the next video in the series, which will cover the gradual taxes that start leading to the protests that are going to lead to the American Revolution. So that I don't want to get really too far on that right now. So the French and Indian War, it's definitely a big colonial war, but it's not direct American Revolution, but it does have a heavy impact on the American Revolution that is to come because Britain has now gained all of these lands and the settlers want to move west. Well, there's going to be some obstacles. And on top of that, it also has some other implications, such as, for example, we said that this very, very, very famous guy, actually two famous guys, this guy becomes king during that time. So this is the guy we're going to start rebelling against. So that's significant. That's going to kind of bring it about. And then our future first president and our big military leader during the revolution, Mr. George, he gets his first really big military command and experience during the war. This is where he really starts learning how to be a commander. That he'll need that experience when the American Revolution pops out. And just to also add this as well, although the French had been kicked during the war, when France was seeming that it was going to invade the colonies because it was going so well before the British turned the tide, it really was the first time, the French and Indian War was really the first time that the 13 British colonies actually started to try to see themselves as they were one. They might be separate colonies, but we are united in a cause, and that we will, if we fight together, we can defeat basically anything. But if we stay divided, we will surely fall. It's really the first time, because before this, the colonies were largely divided. They fought for themselves. If you were from New York, you were known as a New Yorker. If you were from Georgia, you were a Georgian, South Carolinian, Pennsylvanian, whatever you want to call it. You didn't classify yourself as American. You classified yourself as whatever colony you came from. However, during this war, due to the common enemy that the colonies faced, the common threat they had from France if it won the war, they kind of started. This was the first time they really started to band together, and the first time they really started to develop this sense of a national unity that they had together. Even though they weren't considering independence as a nation yet, it was the first time that national unity was really being formed in their land. So to them, it was definitely a important thing that occurred, as it gives them their first taste that we are one. We may be separate, but we are one. So that is the French and Indian War. It's the big prelude here, as it really sets off a lot of the things that are going to end up coming to the American Revolution, as we're going to start introducing in the second video, what I will post by the end of the week. My goal is to have this wrapped up by the 4th of July. That way it's in time for the 4th of July holiday and everyone can enjoy themselves, including myself. So we will get on with that later this week. Be sure to like, subscribe if you'd like to. I heavily suggest that if you are possibly wanting to see the other videos here on the series that are going to come out here on the American Revolution, I highly suggest that you at least subscribe. That way you know when the video comes out and you can go ahead and watch it. I would highly suggest that if you have any comments about anything, be sure to leave them in the comment section down below. So be able to leave me anything that you have in there. As always, I'm still open to the suggestions, even though we're doing a series. I will kick them in as soon as the series is done. I'll kick the ideas into place if I get any. So still feel free. Don't feel that I'm not going to do it just because I'm doing a series. Feel free to do that if you have one. So that basically wraps it up for this video. Hope everyone continues to have a safe and prosperous week. And we will see you all back here with the second video for the American Revolution, as we talk about the protests that are going to lead to the outbreak of independence calls. The United States, children, is about to be born, and the world is not going to be the same.